What happens when a poor woman is forced into a marriage inside a world of billionaires, treated like a ghost in her own home, until a single public moment exposes a hidden injustice no one expected to see? Because when the cold CEO realizes, too late, that the woman he ignored is the key to everything he's about to lose, power shifts, secrets surface, and nothing remains under his control. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The sound of the antique clock in the dining room struck 7 when Anne descended the last steps of the staircase, already knowing he wouldn't be there. He never was. Still, her body kept the strange habit of bracing itself for a presence that never came. Shoulders subtly tense, breath held, eyes sweeping the vast mansion as if she might stumble upon him by accident. The table was set for 2, as always, immaculate, symmetrical, cold. The coffee cooled in the cup that would never be touched. She sat alone. The maid crossed the room in silence, avoiding eye contact, as if she too had learned that certain absences in that house were unspoken rules. Anne lifted the cup to her lips out of reflex alone. The bitter taste made her close her eyes for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't the coffee. It never was. 2 years. 2 years living in that house like a carefully chosen piece of furniture, expensive, functional, and ignored. 2 years being a wife only on paper, in the surname she had learned to carry with an odd mixture of shame and resignation. Lewis, Anne Lewis. The name still sounded borrowed, something that had never truly belonged to her. She stood up before the clock reached 7:05. She had learned to leave early enough not to cross paths with him in the corridor, early enough not to hear the firm, controlled footsteps that belonged to the billionaire CEO she had married without ever being chosen. Outside, the driver opened the door with his usual efficiency. Anne thanked him with a discreet nod. The world beyond the gates greeted her with the distant noise of the city waking up. And for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, she felt something close to relief. Outside that house, she existed a little more. Her parents' accounting office sat in an old building, far from the glass towers and luxury life Mark ruled so effortlessly. Here, the air felt heavier, saturated with paperwork and worries that never truly disappeared. Bruce looked up when his daughter entered, and the smile he tried to offer faded before it could fully form. "You didn't have to come today," he said too quickly. Anne placed her bag on the desk and took a slow breath. "I know. I wanted to." Hannah appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on a cloth that had seen better days. Her mother's eyes carried that quiet guilt that never dissolved, no matter how many times they repeated that they had done what was necessary. Necessary. The word echoed inside Anne like an old sentence. She sat between them, listening more than speaking, absorbing numbers, deadlines, veiled threats from banks with no patience for human stories. At some point, while her father explained yet another attempt at renegotiation, Anne realized she was clenching her hands far too tightly. Her nails pressed into her skin and she didn't let go. "Anne," Hannah said softly, "are you okay?" She nodded automatically. She was used to saying yes. The problem was that lately, the yes came with a deep exhaustion, a kind of fatigue that had nothing to do with the body. When she returned to the mansion late in the afternoon, something felt different. An envelope rested on the hall table, heavy, elegant, her name written in precise handwriting. Anne stopped before touching it, as if it might vanish if observed too long. Inside, an invitation. A high-profile corporate event, a gala dinner, powerful names printed in discreet lettering. In the lower corner, a short note, almost impersonal. "You will attend with me." There was no signature. None was needed. Anne's heart beat faster, not with anticipation, but with an old irritation rising slowly, like something that had finally found room to breathe. 2 years of being ignored, abandoned emotionally, and now an order. She closed the envelope with exaggerated care and went upstairs to the bedroom she had occupied alone since the beginning of that fake relationship. She sat on the edge of the bed, facing the mirror. The woman staring back had eyes that watched too closely, as if always expecting something that never arrived. Not for the first time, she wondered if Mark even knew their exact color. That night, Anne descended the stairs dressed simply, elegantly, without effort. It wasn't an attempt to impress. It was merely who she had been before learning to make herself invisible, before becoming the poor woman absorbed into a billionaire romance built on contracts and class difference. Mark stood at the bottom of the staircase, impeccable as always, his dark suit shaping a body made to occupy power. A rich man, a cold CEO, a powerful man trained to dominate boardrooms, not hearts. He lifted his gaze when she approached. There was a second of unfamiliar silence. Anne felt it before understanding it. Something in the air had shifted, a hesitation, minimal, almost imperceptible. His blue eyes lingered longer than usual, as if adjusting focus. There was no compliment, no smile, only a brief nod. "Let's go," he said. In the car, the silence was dense. Anne watched the city lights blur past the window, feeling that familiar sensation of being taken, never invited. When they arrived at the illuminated ballroom, the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, seemed to swallow what little space she held within herself. Mark introduced her as his wife, with the same ease he would present a signed contract. Anne responded politely, smiled when required, but something inside her was awake, stirred from a sleep that had lasted too long. Maybe it was the atmosphere. Maybe it was simply being there after 2 years of social invisibility. It happened during a conversation about European markets. "You studied at UCLA, didn't you?" Anne turned, startled. The man before her wore an open, genuine smile. Michael Adams. The name came with a firm handshake, with eyes that didn't slide past her in search of someone more important. "Yes," she replied. "Business administration, with a focus on emerging markets." His eyes lit up. "Fascinating. Very few people here truly understand that field." Something unfamiliar expanded in Anne's chest. It wasn't vanity. It was recognition. She spoke of past projects, international negotiations, languages she rarely had the chance to use. Michael listened, asked thoughtful questions, laughed at the right moments. She didn't notice immediately the way Mark watched them from across the table. When she did, it was already too late. Something new had surfaced. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was a primitive discomfort, something Mark couldn't name, manifesting in the way his fingers tightened around his glass, in the sudden rigidity of his jaw. He watched Anne as if seeing her for the first time. Not the quiet, fake wife who slipped through hallways too early, but a living, intelligent woman, admired, desired. On the drive back, the silence felt different, sharper. "You never mentioned you spoke so many languages," Mark said suddenly. Anne turned slowly, surprised not by the question, but by the fact that he was speaking to her at all. Truly speaking. "You never asked." The words hung between them, heavy. Mark didn't respond. The car continued forward, and Anne turned back to the window, feeling something dangerous grow inside her. Not hope, not yet, but the unsettling certainty that something had cracked, and there was no returning to what had existed before. That night, lying alone in her bed, Anne struggled to sleep. She thought of Michael's attentive gaze, of the simple dignity of being seen, and of Mark's look, confused, intense, almost frightened. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely invisible, and somehow that realization hurt more than the silence ever had. Mark didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the vast bedroom that had never truly been shared, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer an explanation for the unfamiliar pressure in his chest. He had closed his eyes, tried to summon spreadsheets, mergers, numbers, anything orderly, anything that had always obeyed him. But Anne's voice kept returning instead. Calm, clear, confident. Speaking about markets, he himself had once pretended to master better than anyone else in the room. He had built an empire by reading people quickly, by categorizing them, by deciding their value within seconds. For 2 years, Anne had occupied a single convenient category in his mind: obligation, a clause, a solution to a financial problem that wasn't even his own. The poor girl whose family's desperation had aligned neatly with a business strategy. The fake wife required to seal a deal, nothing more. And yet tonight, watching another man lean toward her, listening, truly listening, Mark had felt something dangerously close to humiliation. Not because of Michael Adams, but because of himself. For the first time, the thought crept in uninvited. What else have I ignored? Morning came without rest. Mark dressed with mechanical precision, his movements sharp, controlled. The cold CEO persona slid into place as easily as ever, armor he had worn since youth. At the breakfast table, Anne's seat was empty. He paused, noticing it in a way he never had before. "She already left," the maid said quietly, setting down his coffee. Mark nodded, irritation flickering briefly. He told himself it didn't matter. Told himself he was reacting to disruption, not absence. Still, when he entered his office an hour later, the familiar satisfaction of power didn't settle as it usually did. During a board meeting, while executives discussed international expansion, Mark's attention drifted, an unforgivable lapse. Emerging markets. Europe. The words echoed with Anne's voice layered beneath them. He tightened his jaw. After the meeting ended, he did something that surprised even himself. He asked for her file. Not the prenuptial agreement, not the legal documents that had reduced her to an asset. Her background. The assistant hesitated, then complied. Mark read in silence. UCLA, honors, consulting work abroad, languages listed with clinical brevity, achievements that should have commanded respect in any room he ruled. He felt something twist inside him, an emotion he had never learned to navigate. Guilt was inefficient. Regret was pointless. Those were the lessons drilled into him by his father, by a lifetime of ruthless success. Yet the truth pressed in, unavoidable. He had been the arrogant boss in his own home. Worse, he had been indifferent. That evening, Anne returned later than usual. When she stepped into the hallway, she froze. Mark was there, not passing through, not on his phone, waiting. The silence stretched, thick with years of things unsaid. "I didn't know," he said finally. Anne didn't move. Didn't know what? Who you were. A bitter smile touched her lips, brief and sharp. "You had 2 years. He deserved that." He felt it land, heavy, deserved. "I know." She studied him, guarded, as if expecting another injustice to follow. 2 years of being ignored did that to a person. It taught them not to trust sudden attention. "I'm not interested in being noticed now," she said quietly. "Not because someone else looked at me." The words struck deeper than she could know. Mark inhaled slowly. "That's not—" "It is," she interrupted. Her voice didn't rise. That was worse. "You don't get to wake up because another man saw me. I existed before that." She turned to leave. On impulse, raw, uncalculated, Mark reached out. His fingers brushed her wrist. Anne stiffened. The contact lasted less than a second, but it felt seismic. Mark withdrew immediately, as if burned. "I'm sorry," he said. The word unfamiliar, heavy. "I won't touch you unless you want me to." She looked at him then, really looked, as if searching for mockery, for manipulation. Finding none unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. "Good," she said, "because I won't be humiliated again." She walked away, leaving Mark alone with the echo of her footsteps and the first crack in the life he thought unshakable. Over the next days, the shift was subtle. Mark didn't announce change. He acted. He canceled meetings, arrived home earlier, asked, awkwardly, if she'd like to have dinner together. The first time, Anne declined without explanation. The second time, she hesitated. At the table, conversation was careful, restrained. Mark listened more than he spoke, asked about her day, about her parents, about work she no longer did. "You were fired," he said, not as an accusation, but a realization. "I quit," she corrected. "I didn't have a choice." Another injustice added to the list, another thing taken from her and repackaged as necessity. Michael Adams called that week. Anne answered in the garden, phone pressed to her ear, laughter soft but real. Mark watched from inside, something dark and unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Jealousy was irrational, dangerous. He had always considered it a weakness. Now it felt like truth. At a restaurant one evening, Michael joined them by coincidence, or so Anne believed. Mark didn't miss the way heads turned, the way people noticed the contrast. The billionaire CEO, the elegant poor woman on his arm, the charming investor whose attention lingered too openly. When Michael excused himself, Mark's voice was low. "He's interested in you." Anne didn't deny it. Yes. The admission felt like a challenge, or maybe a boundary. "You don't belong to him," Mark said before thinking. Silence fell hard. "I don't belong to anyone," Anne replied, calm but lethal. "Least of all you." People were watching. Mark saw it too late. The rich man exposed, embarrassed by emotion he didn't control. He forced himself to breathe. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I don't know how to do this, but I'm trying." Anne's eyes searched his face, not for charm, not for wealth, but for sincerity. What she found scared her more than indifference ever had, because sincerity could fail. It could vanish, and she wasn't sure she would survive being abandoned twice. That night, Mark stood outside her bedroom door for a long time, then walked away. The slow burn between them intensified. Glances held too long, silences heavy with words neither trusted enough to speak. Anne resisted every instinct to soften. She had learned what happened to poor women who believed rich men too easily. Then, one night, he said it. "You have power over me." The confession stripped him bare. A powerful man admitting vulnerability, not as strategy, but as truth. Anne's breath caught. "That's dangerous," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed. "But it's real." When he finally said "I love you," it wasn't dramatic. It was desperate, honest, terrifying. She told him the truth then, the one she had guarded with quiet dignity for 2 years. "I've never been with anyone," she said. "Not even you." Shock crossed his face, followed by something deeper. Reverence, shame. Their first night wasn't driven by hunger, but by patience, by care, by the understanding that intimacy was not owed, but chosen. It changed them both. For a moment it seemed like redemption had arrived, until Anne found the contracts, hidden, precise, cold, the marriage, a clause, a condition of a merger. She had been exploited, sold twice. She left that night. No argument, no tears, just a suitcase and a shattered heart. Mark returned to an empty house and finally understood loss. What followed would test everything he believed about power, money, and love, and whether karma would demand a price higher than $15 million. Anne woke before dawn in the hotel room, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the muted hum of traffic outside. For a few seconds, she didn't remember where she was. Then the truth settled in, heavy and merciless. The contracts, the hidden truth. The realization that even the moments that had felt real, tender, life-changing, were built on something rotten underneath. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her chest, as if the ache there might respond to pressure. The room was tasteful, expensive, anonymous. A place meant for people who passed through lives without staying. It felt fitting. Her phone lay on the nightstand. 12 missed calls. Mark. She turned the device face down without listening to a single message. If she heard his voice now, she knew she would break, and breaking felt too much like surrender. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection. The woman looking back seemed older, hollowed out by a heartbreak she had never allowed herself to imagine. She thought of the poor girl she had been when her parents had come to her with desperate eyes and shaking hands. The girl who had agreed to marry a billionaire CEO to save her family from prison. She had told herself it was a transaction, that dignity could survive anything if carefully guarded. She had been wrong. 2 days passed, then 3. Anne barely left the room. She ignored calls from her parents, from Michael, from numbers she didn't recognize. The world outside felt hostile, loud, indifferent. On the 4th morning, nausea woke her abruptly. At first, she dismissed it as stress. Heartbreak did strange things to the body, but when it returned, stronger, accompanied by a dizziness that forced her to sit on the edge of the bed, fear crept in. The pharmacy was 3 blocks away. She walked there slowly, wrapped in a coat that felt too thin, her thoughts spiraling despite her efforts to contain them. The cashier didn't look at her twice. To the world, she was just another woman passing through, carrying a quiet, sad story no one would ever know. Back in the room, Anne stared at the small plastic stick for a long time before gathering the courage to look. Positive. The room seemed to tilt. She sank onto the bed, one hand instinctively covering her stomach. A life-changing truth had revealed itself in the most fragile, unexpected way. A child. Mark's child. Conceived not from obligation, not from a contract, but from the one moment in her life that had felt honest and whole. Tears came then, silent, relentless. This was not the dramatic joy stories promised. It was fear, love, grief, and hope tangled together. She was no single mom yet, but the possibility hovered close, terrifying and real. She thought of Mark's face when she had told him she was a virgin, of the care in his touch, of the way he had looked at her afterward, as if she were something sacred. And then she remembered the contracts again, the cold language, the injustice of it all. She wiped her tears. Whatever this was, she would face it with dignity. Mark, meanwhile, was unraveling. The boardroom was silent as he stood at the head of the table, documents spread before him. His father sat across from him, expression sharp, calculating. "You're overreacting," Robert Anderson said coolly. "This merger is essential. The marriage served its purpose." Mark felt something snap. For the first time in his life, he didn't moderate his voice. "She is not a purpose." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Don't be sentimental. You're a billionaire, not a poet." "I'm a human being," Mark replied. "Something you never taught me how to be." The executives shifted uncomfortably. This was not the cold CEO they knew. This was a man stripped bare. "If you walk away from this," Robert warned, "you lose 15 million. Influence, leverage." Mark gathered the contracts in his hands. "Then I lose it." The decision was immediate, irreversible. He tore through the merger with surgical precision, returning the money, dismantling months of strategy without hesitation. It wasn't impulsive. It was clarity. That afternoon, he went to Anne's parents. Bruce looked up as Mark entered the office, shock giving way to fear. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," Mark said, "and I'm here to fix it." He explained everything, the hidden clause, the exploitation. Hannah cried openly. Bruce's hands shook. "I'm canceling the merger," Mark said, "and I'm returning every cent, with interest." They stared at him, stunned. "Why?" Bruce asked hoarsely. "Because your daughter is worth more than my company," Mark replied. "More than my name, more than everything." He left them with checks and apologies that felt inadequate, then drove to the hotel. Anne opened the door cautiously, already prepared to close it again. Mark stood there, eyes red, posture stripped of its usual authority. "I ended it," he said before she could speak. "All of it, the merger, the money." Silence stretched between them. "You didn't have to," she said finally. Yes, I did, he answered, because loving you means choosing you, not once, every time. Her defenses wavered, but didn't fall. It doesn't erase what you did. I know, he said softly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Anne hesitated, then stepped back. He entered, careful, restrained, as if any wrong movement might shatter what little ground he had gained. There's something else, she said, voice unsteady. He looked at her, heart pounding. I'm pregnant. For a second, the world stopped. Then Mark covered his face, shoulders trembling as a sound escaped him that was half laugh, half sob. When he looked up, tears streamed freely. This baby, he whispered, stepping closer but not touching her, will be born from love, not from a contract. I swear to you. She believed him, not because he was a rich man or a powerful man, but because he had chosen loss without hesitation. They didn't reunite that night. Trust took time. But something fundamental had shifted. 6 months later, the garden of the Anderson estate looked different. Softer, less imposing. Chairs were arranged simply. No press, no spectacle. Anne stood in a white dress adapted gently around her 6-month pregnant belly. She looked radiant, not because of luxury, but because of peace. Mark waited for her, no longer the cold CEO, but a man reborn. When he spoke his vows, his voice broke. 2 years ago, I married you for convenience. Today, I marry you because I can't imagine life without you. You taught me love. You taught me how to be human. Anne's voice was steady. You taught me that true love is worth waiting for, that people can change, that second chances are real. They kissed as equals. A year later, the office of Lewis and Davis International Consulting buzzed with quiet purpose. 15 employees, 3 countries, no excess, just work that mattered. Anne led negotiations with calm authority. Mark handled strategy, proud to stand beside her, not above. Their son, Bruce Mark Lewis, slept peacefully in Anne's arms one afternoon as Mark asked his familiar question. Do you regret it? He asked softly. Staying with me after everything? Anne looked at her husband, her child, the life they had rebuilt from broken truths. She smiled. Never, she said. You proved that true love is worth more than any amount of money. He wrapped his arms around both of them, the past finally quiet. And in that embrace, the emotional story of a poor woman and a powerful man reached its redemption. Proof that even the coldest hearts can change, and that love, when chosen freely, always wins. Anne didn't move back into the mansion right away. After the revelation, after the decision Mark had made so publicly and so violently against the life he had been raised to protect, something in her still needed distance. Not space born of punishment, but of survival. Trust, once broken so completely, did not reassemble itself simply because a rich man chose love over money, especially not for a woman who had learned early and painfully what it meant to be exploited. So she stayed in the hotel for another week. Mark respected it. Every morning, he sent a message, never demanding, never dramatic, sometimes just a sentence. I'm here. Sometimes nothing at all, only flowers left at the reception desk with no card, as if even his presence needed to be gentle now. Anne noticed the restraint. It mattered more than any grand gesture. Michael Adams visited once. He knocked softly, already knowing the answer to the question he was about to ask. Anne let him in, grateful for the familiarity, for the calm intelligence in his eyes that had never tried to claim her. You look tired, he said gently. I am. He nodded. I won't ask you to explain. They sat across from each other, two people who understood that some stories were too heavy to retell. Finally, Michael smiled, sad, kind. He changed, didn't he? Anne hesitated. Then, honestly, yes. That doesn't happen often, Michael said. Not to men like him. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Michael stood, adjusting his jacket. Then don't let fear steal what courage already earned. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he loves you. I saw it before he did. When he left, Anne cried. Not from heartbreak this time, but from release. From knowing she hadn't imagined it. From knowing that someone else had witnessed the transformation too. 2 days later, she went back to the mansion. It felt different the moment she crossed the threshold. Quieter, not in sound, but in tension. Mark stood in the hall, unsure, almost nervous. A billionaire, a powerful man who had faced hostile takeovers without blinking, now waiting like a man afraid of saying the wrong thing. You can take the master bedroom, he said immediately. I'll move into the guest room. Anne studied him. We'll decide together, she said. It was a small sentence. It rearranged everything. Their days rebuilt slowly, deliberately. No pretending the past hadn't happened. No pretending love erased damage. Some nights they talked until exhaustion softened the edges of old pain. Other nights, silence returned. But it was no longer empty. It was shared. Anne's pregnancy progressed, grounding her in ways she hadn't expected. The child anchored her to the present, to the reality that this was no longer only her story. Mark attended every appointment, listened to every instruction, memorized every heartbeat like it was a miracle he didn't deserve. He never missed one. Robert Anderson visited once. He stood stiffly in the living room, eyes flicking to Anne's belly with something unreadable crossing his face. You're dismantling decades of work, he said to his son. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I'm building something better, Robert scoffed. Sentiment doesn't last. Anne spoke then, calmly, evenly. Neither does power built on exploitation. Robert looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time. The poor girl he had once dismissed was gone. In her place stood a woman, unafraid. He left without another word. The renewal ceremony was small, almost painfully simple, compared to the luxury life that once defined everything Mark touched. No press, no shareholders, just witnesses who mattered. Anne walked toward him beneath the open sky, the soft weight of her pregnancy grounding her steps. She wasn't being given away. She was choosing. When they spoke their vows, there was no performance, no illusion, only truth. Afterward, when the guests had gone and the garden quieted, Mark rested his forehead against hers. I spent my whole life believing control was strength. And now, she asked, now I know surrender can be. A year later, the office they shared in New York felt alive in a way the old towers never had. Modest, focused, purposeful. Anne's voice carried authority not because of her husband's name, but because of her own earned expertise. Employees respected her, partners listened. Mark watched it all with something like awe. Their son arrived on a quiet morning. Bruce Mark Lewis, small, perfect. When Mark held him for the first time, something ancient broke open in his chest. This was love without contracts, without conditions, without fear. That night, as Anne slept with the baby against her chest, Mark stood by the window, city lights reflecting softly across the room. He understood then that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a choice. Every day. And this life rebuilt from injustice, from class difference, from a story that could have ended as another sad story of a poor woman used and discarded by a rich man, had become something else entirely. Not a fairy tale, a true story, one where love didn't arrive easily. But when it did, it was chosen. Time did not erase what had happened. It reshaped it. Anne learned that healing was not a straight line, not even with love present. Some mornings she woke with a quiet certainty that they were building something unbreakable. Other mornings, a memory would surface without warning, a document, a signature, a sentence that reduced her to a clause. And her chest would tighten, as if it were all happening again. Mark learned to recognize those mornings. He never asked, "What's wrong?" He simply adjusted, canceled meetings, made tea, sat nearby without invading her space. The billionaire who once controlled markets now measured his strength by how gently he could exist beside the woman he had once ignored. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury life and social gap, slowly lost its sharp edges. Anne brought small changes, books on the coffee tables, fresh flowers she arranged herself, music in the evenings. The house began to feel less like a fortress built by a powerful man and more like a place where a family might actually live. Mrs. Thompson noticed first. She had served wealthy families for decades, watched marriages rot behind polished doors, seen poor women humiliated by power and money more times than she cared to remember. One afternoon, while helping Anne sort through baby clothes, she paused. "You know," she said quietly, "this house hasn't felt warm in a very long time." Anne looked up. "Does it now?" Mrs. Thompson smiled. "It does." Mark overheard it from the hallway. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there absorbing the truth that warmth was not bought. It was earned. The press eventually noticed. A billionaire CEO dismantling a profitable merger, returning millions, stepping back from public appearances. Whispers followed him into every boardroom. Some called it a midlife crisis, others a strategic mistake. A few suggested he'd been manipulated by a poor woman who had known exactly what she was doing. Anne read one article late at night and closed the laptop with shaking hands. "They'll never stop," she said softly. Mark took the computer from her and shut it down. "Then let them talk. I spent my life being respected. I'd rather be human." That answer mattered more than any defense. The pregnancy advanced, and with it came moments Anne hadn't anticipated. Flashes of fear that had nothing to do with Mark and everything to do with the world. Would their child be judged by class difference? By lineage? By the shadow of a man known as a cold CEO who had once chosen money over people? One evening, as they walked slowly through the garden, Anne stopped. "What if we fail?" she asked. Mark didn't answer immediately. He had learned that rushing reassurance often came from fear, not confidence. "Then we fail honestly," he said at last. "Not by cheating, not by abandoning each other. That's all I can promise." It was enough. The company they built together started quietly. No announcement, no spectacle. Just a modest office space in New York, sunlight filtering through tall windows, desks assembled by hand. Anne interviewed every hire herself. She looked for competence, yes, but also for dignity. For people who had been overlooked, mistreated, fired unfairly, wrongfully accused. People who understood what injustice felt like. Mark watched her in those interviews, saw the way candidates straightened when she listened, how respect transformed them before his eyes. It was a lesson no MBA had ever taught him. Lewis and Davis International Consulting grew slowly, deliberately. No exploitation, no hidden clauses, no fake relationships built for optics, just work done cleanly, transparently. Michael Adams became their first international partner. When he walked into the office, Anne felt a brief flicker of the past. What might have been, what could have happened if life had twisted differently. Michael sensed it too and smiled. "You chose the harder story," he said. Anne nodded. "The truer one." He shook Mark's hand firmly. "Don't waste it." Mark never did. Their son arrived during a rainstorm. Anne labored quietly, fiercely, refusing to let fear take control. Mark stayed by her side, holding her hand, whispering apologies that no longer sounded like guilt but like devotion. When the baby cried for the first time, Mark broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just tears slipping down his face as he held something that trusted him without knowing his past. Bruce Mark Lewis. The name carried weight and hope in equal measure. Anne watched them together and felt something settle inside her. This this fragile, imperfect family, was not the result of wealth or power. It was the result of choice. Months passed. Sleep deprivation replaced old anxieties. Laughter returned in unexpected places. Mark learned how to warm bottles, change diapers, rock a crying child at 3 in the morning while murmuring nonsense just to hear his son calm. One night, exhausted, Anne leaned against the nursery door and watched him. "You're a good father," she said. Mark looked up, eyes red from lack of sleep and emotion. "I'm trying to be the man he deserves." "And me?" she asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. "Every day." The question that haunted her for so long finally lost its power. A year after the renewal ceremony, they returned to the garden where they had spoken their vows again, this time with their son between them, crawling clumsily over the grass, laughing at nothing at all. Mark lifted Bruce into his arms and turned to Anne. "Do you ever think about who we were?" She did. Often. "Yes," she said. "But I don't miss them." He smiled. "Neither do I." As the sun dipped low, Anne rested her head against his shoulder. The poor girl who had once agreed to a marriage out of desperation was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and class difference, and had not been broken by it. This was no longer a sad story. It was a redemption. Not because a rich man fell in love, but because he learned, too late and just in time, that love was never a transaction. And because a woman who had been ignored, humiliated, and nearly erased chose not revenge, but truth. Together, they stood not as symbols of rich versus poor, not as a billionaire romance for headlines, but as proof that even in a world built on power and money, a different ending was possible, a real one. Anne used to believe that peace would feel loud when it finally arrived. She imagined relief like something dramatic, a moment where the past lost its grip all at once, where the weight of being ignored, mistreated, and emotionally abandoned would simply fall away. But peace, she learned, was quiet. It arrived in fragments, in mornings that didn't begin with dread, in afternoons where her thoughts didn't circle old humiliations, in evenings where silence no longer meant absence. It arrived slowly enough that she almost missed it. The first real test came unexpectedly. A former executive from Anderson Enterprises requested a meeting with Mark. Officially, it was about future collaboration. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. The industry hadn't forgiven him. A billionaire who walked away from $15 million for love was no longer predictable, and unpredictability frightened powerful people. Anne sat beside him in the conference room, her hands resting calmly on the table. She noticed how the men across from them kept addressing Mark, even when Anne answered questions more precisely. Old habits, old hierarchies, rich versus poor thinking that never fully died. "She'll handle negotiations," Mark said at one point, his voice steady. "She's better at this." A flicker of surprise crossed their faces. Anne spoke clearly, confidently, dismantling assumptions without aggression. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't prove herself. She simply existed as the expert she had always been. Afterward, in the elevator, Mark exhaled slowly. "You didn't need me at all." Anne smiled faintly. That was never the point. That night, alone on the balcony, Mark admitted something he had never said aloud. "I thought power meant never needing anyone." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know it meant never letting anyone matter." The words carried no self-pity, just truth. Not everyone celebrated their transformation. An anonymous article surfaced weeks later, accusing Anne of manipulating Mark, of orchestrating a fake relationship that turned into a calculated takeover. Words like gold digger, poor woman who climbed too high, secret identity were thrown around with casual cruelty. Anne read it twice, then a third time. The old ache stirred, the familiar sense of being wrongfully accused without the chance to defend herself. She had lived that reality before, quietly, privately, without witnesses. Mark found her sitting still, the screen dark in her lap. "I can make it disappear," he said immediately. She looked up. "No." The word surprised him. "If we erase every lie," she continued, "we teach them nothing. Let it exist. Let it fail on its own." It was a risk, a woman choosing restraint in a world that expected reaction. Mark nodded, respecting her choice even when every instinct told him to protect her by force. The article faded, not because it was silenced, but because the truth outlived it. Months later, Anne stood in front of a room filled with young professionals, many from backgrounds like hers, not rich, not powerful, some single moms juggling ambition and exhaustion, some single dads rebuilding after losses no one acknowledged, people who understood struggle not as a concept, but as a daily reality. She spoke without notes. "I was once told my worth had a price," she said, "that my value could be negotiated by men in suits who would never live my consequences. I believed them, until I didn't." The room was silent. "This is not a story about marrying a rich man," she continued. "It's a story about refusing to disappear." Mark watched from the back, unseen, his chest tight with something that felt like awe and accountability intertwined. This woman had not been saved by him. She had survived him. That truth humbled him more than any loss of money ever could. At home, life remained imperfect. They argued sometimes, about schedules, about fatigue, about how much of the past to explain to their son one day. But arguments no longer carried the threat of abandonment. They ended with understanding, not silence. One evening, as Mark rocked Bruce to sleep, Anne leaned against the doorframe. "You're thinking again," she said. "I was wondering," he replied softly, "if you had walked away, truly walked away, would you have been okay?" Anne considered it carefully. "Eventually," she said. "But I would have been smaller, quieter, more guarded." He swallowed. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," she said, "but only because you changed." That distinction mattered. Years later, when their company expanded into a fourth country, when Bruce ran through the office halls calling everyone by name, when Anne signed contracts without fear of hidden clauses. She sometimes remembered the girl who drank cold coffee alone at a table set for two. That girl had thought love was something endured. She had been wrong. Love, she learned, was chosen, again and again, even when it was inconvenient, even when it demanded sacrifice, even when it forced a powerful man to dismantle everything he thought defined him. This was never a fairy tale. It was an emotional story shaped by injustice, humiliation, and a social gap that nearly destroyed them both. And that was precisely why it mattered. Because redemption, when it comes honestly, does not erase the past. It stands beside it and says, "We will do better." And this time, they did. The truth Anne came to understand, slowly, almost reluctantly, was that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. Some nights, long after the house had gone quiet and Bruce slept curled in his crib, she would lie awake beside Mark, staring into the dark. In those moments, the past returned not as pain, but as memory. Sharp-edged, precise, the contracts, the silence, the way she had learned to move through rooms without leaving a trace. Mark sensed those nights without being told. He never reached for her automatically, never assumed closeness. Instead, he waited, and when she finally turned toward him, when her hand found his in the darkness, the gesture felt deliberate, earned. "I remember everything," she said once, her voice barely audible. "I know," he answered, "and I'm grateful you stayed anyway." She corrected him softly. "I didn't stay anyway. I stayed because you stopped being the man who hurt me." That distinction remained the foundation of everything they built. Years passed, measured not by milestones of wealth, but by ordinary moments that once would have felt impossible. School mornings, packed lunches, quiet celebrations that didn't need witnesses. Anne watched Mark become a father who listened, a husband who paused before speaking, a leader who asked instead of commanded. The world continued to change around them. Stories surfaced, articles, podcasts, discussions about corporate ethics, about exploitation disguised as opportunity. Their story was mentioned sometimes, stripped of names, retold as a case study. A billionaire who chose loss. A woman who refused to be erased. A system confronted by its own reflection. Anne never corrected the narrative. She didn't need to. At a conference one afternoon, a young woman approached her hesitantly after a panel discussion. Nervous, determined. "I was fired last year," she said. "Wrongfully accused. I thought my career was over." Anne listened, always listened. "And now?" she asked. "I started again," the woman said. "Smaller, slower, but it's mine." Anne smiled. "Then you're already ahead." That night, walking home through the city lights, Mark asked, "Do you ever wish it had been easier?" Anne considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "If it had been easy, I might have believed love was luck, not choice." He nodded, absorbing it. This was how their life worked now. Truth offered without defense. Lessons learned without shame. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the dining room where Anne had once sat alone with untouched coffee. The table was set again, but this time unevenly. One chair slightly askew, a child's drawing placed at the center. Bruce climbed into his seat, grinning. "Mom made pancakes." Mark laughed. "The best kind of luxury." Anne watched them, the sound of their voices filling the space that once echoed with absence. She felt no bitterness now, only clarity. She had been a poor woman in a world that valued her only for what she could secure. She had been ignored, humiliated, nearly reduced to a footnote in a powerful man's ambition. But she had not remained there. This was not a story about being rescued. It was a story about survival becoming strength, about a man learning that power without empathy was emptiness, about a woman choosing not to harden, even when the world gave her every reason to. Love had not erased the injustice. It had answered it. And in doing so, it had rewritten everything. What did you think of Anne and Mark's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? There came a moment, quiet, unannounced, when Anne realized the story no longer hurt when she remembered its beginning. She was standing in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter. Bruce at her feet building something crooked and ambitious out of wooden blocks. Mark was behind her, sleeves rolled up, unsuccessfully trying to fix a leaky faucet with an expression of intense concentration that would have once terrified entire boardrooms. The sound of water dripping stopped. Mark straightened, triumphant. "I did it," he said, as if he'd closed the biggest deal of his life. Anne smiled. "You did?" It struck her then that there was no tightness in her chest, no echo of the woman who once measured her mornings by how early she needed to leave to avoid being seen. The memory existed, but it no longer ruled her. Healing, she understood, wasn't about erasing scars. It was about no longer living inside them. That evening, after Bruce was asleep, Mark found Anne in the garden. She sat on the bench where they had once stood on opposite sides of fear and hope, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "You're quiet," he said. "I was thinking," she replied, "about who I was before everything." "And?" "I was strong," she said slowly. "Even then. I just didn't know it yet." Mark sat beside her, careful not to crowd her space, even after all these years. "You saved yourself," he said. "I only caught up." She turned to him, surprised. He met her gaze steadily, without defensiveness, without the need to be forgiven again. "I need you to know something," he continued. "If one day you woke up and decided this life no longer fit you, I would still be grateful. You changed me." Anne felt emotion rise, Not sharp, not painful, but full. That's the difference, she said. You're no longer afraid of losing control. He nodded. Because I learned control was never love. The world beyond them continued its endless arguments about money, power, class difference. Rich versus poor narratives never truly disappeared. People still searched for villains and heroes, still wanted clean lines and easy judgments. But their life no longer depended on being understood by strangers. Lewis and Davis International Consulting became known not for its size, but for its integrity, for refusing deals that smelled of quiet exploitation, for listening when others dismissed. Anne insisted on transparency clauses so clear they made some investors uncomfortable. Mark supported every single one. We make less, someone once told him. We sleep better, he replied. Bruce grew up knowing stories, not fairy tales about princes and castles, but real ones. Stories about mistakes, about consequences, about choosing again when the first choice had been wrong. One night, when he was old enough to ask, he looked at Anne seriously. "Mom," he said, "were you sad before?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes." "And now?" "No," she answered. "Now I'm real." He accepted that, satisfied. Years later, long after the headlines had moved on, after the word billionaire had lost its magic and become just another description, Mark asked Anne the question one last time, not out of fear, out of ritual. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Any of it?" Anne looked around. The home built with intention, the work built with fairness, the family built with truth. "No," she said, "because the woman who was humiliated learned her worth, and the man who once ignored it learned how to love." She took his hand, steady and sure. This had never been a story about luxury life, or money, or a cold CEO discovering romance. It was a story about dignity, about a poor woman who refused to disappear, about a powerful man who chose redemption over pride, about love that was not dramatic, but deliberate. And in that choice, made every day, they found something far rarer than wealth. They found peace. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear all our stories, and check out more emotional stories right here on the final screen.